Good to be with you. My name's John. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's my pleasure and my privilege to share some thoughts that God's put in my heart for this evening. We've just had a really amazing period of time in Springs over the last few weeks. It just blows me away when I look at everything that seems to be happening. And I don't know if you feel a little bit like me, but it's almost like we're kind of riding the crest of a wave at the moment. And you're wondering when the wave's actually going to end. It just keeps going on and on. On Easter Sunday, we had 5 baptisms, which was amazing. And then the week after that, we had our 10 birthday celebrations. And then last week, we had Christina from New Zoe sharing with us. And next week, it's Compassion Sunday. So it's just like, you know what I mean, on that kind of crest of the wave, things going on. But if there's one thing I do feel, and I hope you kind of bear with me a little bit this evening, it's this, that I fear for me, and I guess for some of you, we may, in the midst of all of that wonderful manic busyness, we may have actually, in one sense, allowed Easter to pass us by just a little bit too quickly. We spent 40 days in Lent looking forward to the Easter story. We started a men's prayer group. We had lots of texts and WhatsApp messages exchanging, and people were encouraging each other. And then in Holy Week itself, we kind of looked at in some detail the story of what Jesus did in that last week from Palm Sunday going through Easter. And then we get to Resurrection Sunday, and we have a great celebration, but it's almost like we've moved on a little bit too quickly after. So I just want us to this evening, this afternoon, to just pull back a little bit and realise that we are still very much in the season between the Resurrection Sunday and the Ascension of Jesus. We're very much in that period. And I just felt that it was important for us once again just to grasp what the resurrection of Jesus is all about. This is a season in the church where we historically look at some of the appearances of Jesus between his resurrection and his ascension. We look at stories like the miraculous catch of fish, the breakfast that Jesus cooks for his disciples. We look at the story of Jesus restoring Peter. All of these stories that we love and tell. But tonight, I really want to go back to a story that occurred on Easter Sunday, towards the back end of that first Easter Sunday. And we're going to look in just a little bit of detail at the story of the 2 people that encountered Jesus when they were walking to a place called Emmaus. Okay, so we're going to look at this story of the Emmaus Road. And it's from Luke chapter 24, and we're going to read the story together. It starts, if you can have the next slide, Tom, at verse 13. Now behold, 2 of them were travelling that same day, that's Easter Sunday, to a village called Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. Now, this is a really well-known story if you've been in church for some time. It's a story that we talk about most Easters, the story of 2 men leaving Jerusalem, going on a 7-mile journey to a place called Emmaus. But I want us to try and imagine this afternoon just what it might have been like to have been there. We know that these 2 men were followers of Jesus, but we also know that they weren't part of the inner circle. They weren't part of the 12 closest followers of Jesus. They were a little bit more, if you like, on the fringes. They were, let's put it bluntly, they were more like you and I. You know, they were everyday followers of Jesus. They weren't anything particularly significant. We are told in the story the name of one of them. It's the only time his name is mentioned in the whole Bible. We don't know the identity of the other one, but they were just 2 people that had been in Jerusalem for Passover, and they'd heard all of these amazing stories. We're going to see in this story that they'd heard the rumours about the resurrection. And yet, for whatever reason,
they'd still decided to travel back to Emmaus, which might have been home, we guess, that night. Now, if you'd been in Jerusalem, if you were a follower of Jesus, and you'd seen the events leading up to the crucifixion, and then you'd heard the rumors of the resurrection, why on earth would you decide to leave Jerusalem at that time? Don't you think that's kind of quite interesting? They'd been in Jerusalem for the Passover, but why did they decide of that day of all days that they had to go back? Perhaps it was family commitments. Perhaps they got work in the morning. Perhaps their hotel reservation was just for 2 nights and it had expired. Perhaps they'd run out of money. They couldn't afford to stay in Jerusalem, the most expensive place there is. They perhaps just had run out of cash. They couldn't be there. But for whatever reason, at the end of this day, they decided that they were going to walk 7 miles out of Jerusalem to this place called Emmaus. They had decided what their priority was. And their priority, let's be honest, was to get to Emmaus. It's obvious, isn't it? If their priority had been anything else, they wouldn't have done it, but they made a decision. Now, the first thing I want to bring out of that is that God understands our earthly commitments, and he understands our earthly priorities. I guess quite a few people here have got work in the morning. That's a priority. That's a commitment. You're committed to doing it. But there are sometimes in our Christian walks with God that God actually says, hold on, I'm going to take precedence today, guys. I know you've got your plans. I know you've got your commitments. And I respect that they are really significant. You've got family commitments. You've got work commitments. You've got bills to pay. There's promises that you've made. But every now and then, God may step in and say, I get that. But just for a moment, I'm taking precedence. And he doesn't ask, is that all right? He says, I'm taking precedence. And this was one of those occasions. So verse 15. So it was, while they conversed and reasoned, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were restrained, so that they did not know him. And Jesus said to them, what kind of conversation is this that you have one with another as you walk and are so sad? There's so much to kind of get out of here. Firstly, they were talking about Jesus. They'd made the decision that they've got to get back to Emmaus, but as they were talking about Jesus. And as I was preparing for this, I read this wonderful comment from Spurgeon, the great Victorian preacher. And he said this, when 2 saints are talking together, Jesus is very likely to come along and make the third one up. When 2 saints are talking together, it's quite common for Jesus to decide, I'm going to join in on this. And actually, Spurgeon then goes on to say this, and I really want to encourage you because I know that we've got life groups, we've got men's prayer groups, we've got so much going on. And what we do when we get together, I'm sure, I wasn't able to make the curry last night, but I'm sure that last night you were talking about Jesus. And Spurgeon says this, talk of him and soon you will talk with him. Isn't that brilliant? Talk of him and very soon you'll be talking with him. Jesus drew near. I'm absolutely convinced that when the lads were sitting in the Raj over the road last night talking about Jesus, Jesus drew near. Jesus was there. He heard every word that you said. When 2 of us are talking, he loves to come and join us. Secondly, it seems as if to start with, Jesus actually just kind of drew near to them and just listened. I imagined he kind of walked up along and they were walking, talking about Jesus, and he joined them. And I'm sure for a little while he was quiet and he just listened to what they had to say. Just imagine how wonderful it is when we're talking and Jesus just kind of in the background draws near and he's listening intently to what we're saying. It's fantastic when we we know that he can do that. And thirdly, it was really obvious to Jesus they were sad. What these two men didn't realize yet was they didn't need to be sad. There was actually reason to rejoice, but they didn't know that. At the time that they were there walking back to Emmaus, their hearts were heavy. Although they were talking about Jesus, they were sad, and Jesus actually says that to them. Sometimes we can let things get on top of us so much that we live our lives in sadness when actually the solution is right there with us. That Jesus is right there with us. And just like these two men on the road to Emmaus, so often our eyes are blinded to the fact that he's with us. And we wallow in our own madness, we wallow in our own sorrow, we wallow in our own problems, instead of actually acknowledging that Jesus is with us. And actually, if Jesus is with us, the stuff that we're concerned about, the stuff that we're worried about, actually isn't anywhere near as significant as we believe it is, because God's priorities are not our priorities, and things that we let worry us are not the things that worry Jesus whatsoever. But anyway, Jesus joins them, and he says, "Why are you so sad?" Then, can we have the next slide? Thank you. Okay. Then the one whose name was Cleopas, that's the person we know who it was, answered and said to Jesus, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things which happened there in these days?" Now, can you imagine this situation? They're walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Jesus joins them. He says, "Why are you so sad? What's going on?" And this guy says to Jesus, "Are you the only guy that hasn't got a clue what's going on here?" Of all the people that were involved in the Easter story, Jesus, let's face it, was the number one participant, wasn't he? I imagine Jesus had a bit of a wry smile when Cleopas said that to him. Are you the only guy that doesn't know what's going on? He didn't recognize him. I just think that's a lovely little aside that Jesus kind of just thought, little do you know what's going to happen. But then, verse 19, Jesus said to them, "What things? Are you the only one that don't know about these things?" And Jesus said, "Well, what things?" Jesus obviously knew the things that they were talking about. But Jesus was really skillfully encouraging them to reveal what was on their hearts. He asked them a question which gave them the opportunity to tell him exactly what was on their minds. I don't know if you're like me sometimes, but when you've got an issue that you want to pray about, when you've got a problem in your life, perhaps it's something that you've been living with a long time. I don't know. Some issues with your health, some issues about your work or your lack of work, issues about problems in your family, concerns that you have for your kids or your parents. I don't know. Whatever you're going through in your life, you kind of live with it 24 hours a day, don't you? And when you come to pray about it, do you sometimes have the temptation to say to God, "Lord, you know everything. You know what I'm going through, so I'm just going to ask you to deal with it, or I'm going to pray about it." And actually, you don't take the opportunity to articulate to God what it is that you're going through and how you feel about it. You shortcut sometimes. It's very easy to shortcut. You've got an issue, and you say, "Lord, you know all about that, so I'm just going to pray about it," rather than actually taking the time to tell God. Although God knows, there's a real importance in physically talking to God and telling him what it is that you're concerned about, what it is that you're going through, how it's making you feel, and then what you'd like him to do about it. If he doesn't mind, thank you very much. I think that it's really important that we tell God. If we ever say, "Lord, you know I love you," don't say that to God. Tell him that you love him. Don't say you know. Just tell him what you feel. And I think that can be really cathartic for our good, not for God's good, because he does know. He does know. He doesn't need us. I wasn't going to say this, but it's just come into my mind. There's a classic story in the Acts of the Apostles when John and Peter are taken prisoner right at the beginning of the Acts, and they've healed a guy on the way to the temple, and they get arrested, and there's an amazing prayer meeting that we read about. And in this prayer meeting, the disciples are standing up, and they're actually saying, Lord, you did this, you did that, you did the other, and actually Jesus was crucified, but we know that he's raised from the dead. And they repeat all of the things to God that God already knows has happened, and there's like an earthquake, and the doors open, and Peter and John have been released from prison. They're standing there. Now, they didn't have to say to God, they didn't have to tell God all the things that God's done. He knows. But actually, the spiritual warfare of praying out, telling God the truth, proclaiming over your own life the truth of God, it's part of spiritual warfare. And I want to suggest to you today that when you are praying, even about issues on your own mind, part of the spiritual warfare of claiming the battle can be actually articulating what you're going through to God. Really important to do that. Okay. So Jesus said, what things? So they said to him, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. We were hoping it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, today is the third day since these things happened. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us when they did not find his body. They came saying that they'd seen a vision of angels who'd said he was alive. And certain of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But him they did not see. So when Jesus said what things, they babble it out. The things that are being hung on for the last 3 days. He was crucified. We thought he was going to... Look at what they told Jesus. They actually said they knew his name, Jesus, and where he was from, Nazareth. They knew that he was a prophet. They knew that he was mighty in deed and word. They knew that he was crucified. They knew he'd promised to redeem Israel. They knew others had said he'd rose from the dead. Didn't they know a lot about what had happened? They knew a lot, but they'd missed the main thing. They knew all the facts, but they'd actually missed the main thing. And that main thing was that the Messiah had to be crucified to be able to come back from the dead. So Jesus then says to them in verse 25, he said, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Jesus said they were slow of heart, and they were slow of heart. Their heads had got all the knowledge in the world. They knew Jesus, they knew who he was, they knew what had happened. Their head knowledge was great, but their hearts had not understood. And actually, Jesus told them the problem with their belief was in their heart, not in their head. Sometimes we think the main obstacles to our trust in Jesus are the belief. I can remember on the first Alpha course we did, there were a couple that came to the Alpha course, and they contacted me, and they said, look, we've got some questions about Jesus and about the Bible. Could you come round to our house and we can go through these questions with you? Or I went round to their house, and I'm not exaggerating, they must have had 50 questions written out. 50 questions. Some really basic stuff, some more deep stuff. But as I was there, I realized that if I had answered every one of those 50 questions perfectly, they'd have had another 50. Because they were trying in their heads to find faith. You never get faith in your head. Faith involves a leap of faith, and you have to believe in your heart, and Jesus knew that. He then goes on, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter his glory? They hadn't understood, they knew the Bible, but they hadn't understood what the prophets had said, that the Messiah had to suffer first. These people were common, simple men. They'd lost hope. They'd lost their joy. They spiritually felt deserted. They believed that this guy, Jesus, was going to redeem Israel, was going to be an amazing guy, and they'd lost all of that. They hadn't lost the desire for Jesus. They still loved to talk about him, but they hadn't seen the necessity of the crucifixion and the cross. And then look at this. And beginning, verse 27, beginning at Moses and all of the prophets, Jesus expounded to them the scriptures, the things concerning himself. Jesus taught them from the scriptures from the Old Testament, it would be. Expounding means to let the text speak for itself. We try and expound when we preach at Springs. It's what Jesus did. It's what a good Bible teacher should do. The word that Luke used here, expounded, in Acts he uses it as translated. In other words, Jesus was sticking really close to the scriptures. He was opening the scriptures and expounding on it, but he didn't kind of take any liberties with the scriptures. He kind of translated to them what the scriptures had to say to him. And the amazing thing is this: Jesus explained the things that the Old Testament had to say about himself, because they knew the Old Testament. It was very familiar with them. They were religious people. They understood. Well, they didn't understand the scriptures, but they knew the Old Testament really, really well. And Jesus sat down and said, I'm going to open up the Old Testament to you, and I'm going to show you how every verse in the Old Testament points to me. That's really quite amazing. I think that must have been perhaps the best ever Bible study in the history of Bible studies. Can you imagine sitting down with Jesus and the Old Testament and him saying, I tell you what, guys, I'm going to just show how this Old Testament talks about me. And let me tell you just a few things. I haven't got time to dig into this, but I'm just going to tell you some of the things that Jesus may have told them, okay? From the Old Testament, Jesus would have told them that the Messiah himself was present at the creation of the world, because that's what the Bible says. He would have said that he was the seed of the woman whose heel was bruised. Jesus would have said that the Messiah was the blessing of Abraham to all nations. That promise that Abraham was given was fulfilled actually in Jesus. Jesus would have told them that he was actually a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, who's one of the greatest high priests of all time. Jesus would have said, you know the story about Jacob wrestling? That was me wrestling with Jacob. Jesus would have said, I am the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Jesus would have said to them, when Moses was spoken to by the burning bush, I was there speaking out of the burning bush. I was the Passover lamb. This is incredible how the Old Testament points to Jesus. He would have said, the Messiah is a prophet greater even than Moses. When Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the captain of the Lord's army was there, guess what? It was me. I was there when Jericho fell. He would have said, you know the story about Ruth, and there was this guy that was called a kinsman redeemer, where somebody from your own family redeemed you. That was me it was talking about. I am the son of David, who was a king even greater than David. I am the Saviour that Psalm 22 talks about, of suffering. I'm the good shepherd that Psalm 23 talks about. When you read the Proverbs, I'm the wisdom that the Proverbs is talking about. When you read the Songs of Solomon, I'm the lover that Solomon's writing about. I am the Saviour that Isaiah wrote about in chapter 53, talking about the suffering servant. And then he'd have said, I'm the princely Messiah of Daniel, who said, I'm going to establish a kingdom that would never end. Can you imagine what that Bible study must have been like? Wouldn't you have been hanging on every word? Verse 28, they drew near to the village where they were going, and Jesus indicated to them that he needed to go farther, but they constrained him, saying, abide with us, for it's towards evening, and the day is far spent. So he went in to stay with them. In the Gornal way of talking, can you imagine, them saying, to Jesus, look, we're going in here, and Jesus said, well, I've got to go a bit further. They kind of said to him, you're going nowhere. You're staying with us. This has been absolutely amazing. They constrained him. They persuaded Jesus. They wanted to be with this guy so much that they wanted him. They wanted to spend as much time with him as they possibly could. So verse 30. Now it came to pass, as he sat at the table with them, that he took bread. He blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. Then Their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. That's a bit mean in a way. I'll tell you in a moment. I don't believe it was mean at all. Jesus sat down, took the bread, blessed it and broke it, and their eyes were opened. Now, I don't know about you, but up until this year, up until this time that I've actually prepared this study, I always thought that the reason that when Jesus broke bread, that they recognized him, was because they'd been at the Last Supper. They hadn't. These guys didn't understand the kind of sacramental nature of breaking bread in theological terms. It wasn't that at all. So how did they recognize Jesus in the breaking of bread? We don't know. But there would have been a number of things that Jesus did. The first thing is this. When they sat down to the table, in Jewish culture, there is it's actually falls to the host to do the breaking of bread and the distributing of bread. And Jesus actually took the place of the host at the meal. Somehow they invited him in, but he was in charge, not them. Okay. Perhaps when he just gave the blessing, there was something in Jesus' words that echoed as he blessed the bread, and they just kind of realized this is Jesus. Or perhaps it was as he broke the bread that they actually saw the nail prints in his hands. We don't know. It might have been a combination of that. But whatever it was, whether it was the word, whether it was the place, whether it was the physical seeing of his hands, all of a sudden the scales dropped from their eyes and they knew it was Jesus that was with them. Jesus might be right in front of you now. He could be sitting down with you at every meal, and your eyes have been restrained from seeing him. We need to pray that God will open our eyes to realize just how often Jesus is with us. And actually, he promised that he's with us always. We need those scales from our eyes to fall, because so often we live our lives as if he's not with us, and he is with us. We're nearly finished. Verse 32. And they said to one another, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us? As they were walking along, listening to Jesus, hearing that amazing Bible study, their hearts were burning. They didn't know it was Jesus, but their hearts were burning inside of them. Have you ever felt your heart burning? Perhaps you're even feeling it now. Your heart burning as you hear some words. I remember very, very clearly in September 1975 going to a meeting at Eve Lane Pentecostal Church, and there was a guy preaching, but it wasn't the guy preaching that had any impact on me. He showed a film, and this was a film about a guy whose name was Nicky Cruz. He was quite a famous Christian back in the 60s and 70s. He was the subject of a book called The Cross and the Switchblade. He'd been a gang leader in New York. But this wasn't the story of his life. This was actually, it was probably before videos had been invented, to be honest. It was a film of Nicky Cruz preaching somewhere in America. And as I watched the film, I can honestly say my heart began to burn in my body. And I was listening to what Nicky Cruz was saying, and it had been recorded months or years before, and it was like every word that Nicky Cruz was saying on that film as I watched it was spoken to me. I just knew that there was something happening to me, and that was the night that I gave my life to the Lord, because my heart burnt and I felt the call of Jesus on my life. And God's word can have the same effect now. You can feel that burning in your heart. When I said, wasn't it mean that Jesus kind of, as soon as he revealed himself to them, disappeared? They didn't know until after Jesus had gone that each other's heart was burning. They didn't know that. Jesus almost had to leave to give them time together to unpack what had been going on. I think that's really cool, you know, that all of a sudden he was, did you feel the same way that I did? Yeah. Did you get that sense? Yeah, I did as well. Yeah, isn't it amazing? And Jesus sometimes kind of wants us to minister to each other as well as minister to us directly. So we get to the end of the story. So they rose up that very hour, and guess what? They returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord is risen, and he's appeared to Simon." And then the two of them, Cleopas and the other guy, told them about the things that had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. They set out on what was planned to be a 7-mile journey with heavy hearts, a hot, dusty road to go to Emmaus, a tiring walk after an incredibly difficult few days. I imagine that the 7-mile journey back to Jerusalem was on air, that they didn't notice the miles, they didn't notice the dust, because they'd got nothing other than a passion to tell about the fact that they'd met with Jesus. Whatever plans they'd made, whatever reason they decided they had to leave Jerusalem, they realized that there was something more important than their plans, and that was to tell others that Jesus is alive. And that's really what I just want to leave you with tonight, to say, whatever plans you have for your life, long-term, short-term, there is nothing more important than for you to tell others that you know Jesus, that you've seen him, that he is alive, and that he's died for them.